Hey guys, welcome back to Unit 2, Part 2. This discussion today will be fairly brief but important, and we'll take off from where we left off with the British in Virginia and the Chesapeake, and point our attention further north to New England. Before we get into the stories, though, let me say a few things about what we need to be thinking about with these video lectures regarding and how they relate to the text. As you can tell, you'll probably be able to tell, chapters 2 through roughly 4 kind of cover much of the stuff that I'm talking about here. In other words, this discussion of the Puritans and New England that I'm about to get into doesn't really fall directly into Chapter 2, and so the Unit 2 lecture, as this is called, kind of covers, the lecture itself covers several different chapters. So don't let that be too confusing. You can go back and watch this video as needed. Your quiz for this week will be focused on both the lecture and mostly the lecture really, and some of the textbook as well. So I'll clarify this a little bit in writing, but as we go forward, I'll be talking about some things that are in the Unit 2 reading, and some things that are just generally Unit 2 here in lecture videos. So hopefully that's not too confusing. As always, just shoot me an email or something if you have any questions, if you need something cleared up based on what I'm talking about here in these video lectures, or anything else. All right, so let's get to it. In the last video lecture, I talked about mostly Jamestown and those events preceding and to an extent succeeding Jamestown. What I didn't get into much, you'll read about this in the lecture notes and in your chapters, is the new labor system that was inaugurated following Jamestown's initial settlement. And you'll recall, just as sort of a brief recap here, you'll recall that in the decades following the initial settlement of Jamestown in 1607, indentured servitude came in, where people who had their passage paid to come over and work for 5, 6, 7 years from Europe to America. Then they were free, and that it gradually shifted then to slave labor. So by the middle of the 1600s, especially to the early 1700s, you see a decline in indentured servitude and a subsequent rise then in African slavery, especially in Virginia and the South, of course. There would be slavery throughout much of the North as well, as we'll see, but nothing to the extent that you'll find further south in Virginia with the tobacco and eventually other crops, rice, cotton, and so on. So anyway, that's where we left off last time, and you'll read a lot about the colonial slavery and the slave trade and the Middle Passage. All this is incredibly important stuff, but I'm not going to get into it too much at this stage. Once we get to the immediate pre-Civil War era, 1830s, 40s, and 50s, I'll have an entire lecture or two devoted to the institution of slavery. But be sure to focus in the notes, the lecture notes that I post on Blackboard, as well as in your reading. Focus on that early colonial slavery, the Middle Passage, the experience of the institution of slavery in this period. Okay, so let's move north. We've established Jamestown. It barely survives in the first decade or two. Now by the 1630s and beyond, it is beginning to slowly, but beginning to thrive on the tobacco trade. And we see the institutional economic foundations of the American South. There is a direct line, I don't want to get carried away here, but there really is a direct line from the success of tobacco in Virginia, thanks to John Rolfe and those who came after him, and thanks to slave labor. There's a direct line between that early success of tobacco in Virginia all the way up to the American Civil War. In terms of, here you have a region, the South, that is built, its very foundations are built on slave labor and these cash crops, these labor-intensive cash crops, such as tobacco, eventually cotton, and their entire economic, political, cultural way of life is then centered on this slave labor and agricultural cash crop production. Right? So keep that in mind. We'll revisit this off and on throughout the semester. You'll read a lot about it as well. Now, how does that compare to the new colonies further north? Well, we need to go to around 1620 or so, and we'll backtrack a little here and there, but around 1620 or so to begin the foundations of colonial New England. Right? The beginnings, really, of the future Yankees in the north. Again, I don't want to get too carried away with making these direct comparisons from the 1600s to the 1860s, but there is some connection there. Right? So in 1620, we see the very first permanent British settlement in what we now call, and what they called shortly thereafter, New England, with the story that you all are at least somewhat familiar with, I think, hope, and that is, the Mayflower coming across the Atlantic, and the Pilgrims, the Puritans landing on Plymouth Rock and establishing their new colony there to practice their own way of life, their religion, and so on, right? Which is all basically true. There's a lot more to it. Right. So, background. I have a slide here for you. A map to look at while I talk. So, in the late 15 and very early 1600s, around the same time that the British were attempting to settle points further south, Virginia and so on, and even after Jamestown, there was a large number of British citizens who identified with a Calvinist religion known as Puritanism. And in the very early 1600s, they decided to leave Britain. The British Church, the Anglican Church, Church of England, as it was formed when Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, the English Reformation, a century before, but not quite a century before, back in the 1500s, was Protestant technically. It was it was a church that protested the Catholic Church, just like the Lutherans and the Calvinists and everything else. But according to the Calvinist Puritans living in England at the time, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was still too Catholic. In other words, they didn't like how, what they used, kind of a word they used to describe it, they didn't like how popish the Anglican Church was, and how much it resembled the Catholic Church hierarchy. There wasn't technically a pope. The head of the Anglican Church was the monarch, but you still had the equivalent of bishops and cardinals, those sorts of people. They went by different names and classifications sometimes, not always. And the churches themselves were still these cathedrals with stained glass windows and a lot of pomp and circumstance. In the 1600s, if you walked into an Anglican church in London, you would be hard-pressed to find many differences between that church and a Catholic church, say, in Italy or Spain. Okay, so these Calvinist Protestants decided that they simply couldn't live in a land with all this popish, pompous, Catholic-like Anglican church. These churches, they tried to help reform the Anglican church to make it more like theirs, which we're about to talk about, but it didn't work out. There was some fighting, some small persecution, not a great deal. And long story short, a big chunk of the Puritan population in England fled. They left from England, went across the English Channel, lived in the Netherlands for a little while, Belgium and some of those other areas. But they decided after a few years that they just didn't quite fit in there either. Their children were being taught and raised in sort of this these Dutch school systems, if they even had school systems. But the kids were becoming too Dutch, actually. I think that's a direct quote from some of the early Puritans, and they wanted something different. Right? So it's at this stage then, this would be by the 16 teens, long after Jamestown had been established already, that many of the Puritans in Belgium and other places they get together and decide to shoot for the New World. They've read about, like all Europeans, they'd read about the exploits of John Smith and the establishment of Jamestown. And by this point, by the 16 teens, tobacco was slowly starting to make some profits over in the New World, and more people were moving across the ocean, mostly as indentured servants, as you know, to settle in Jamestown. And the Chesapeake Bay area was expanding significantly. And so these Puritans, these former British citizens, decided to try their luck. They thought this might be a good spot to go. Let's go to, this is actually what they were thinking, let's go to Virginia, to Jamestown, and from that point we can spread off and go live kind of by ourselves a short distance away and practice our own faith, practice the Calvinist Puritan faith. Again, we'll talk about what that is in a minute, and do so in peace. And our children won't be brought up in these Dutch ways, and they won't be poisoned by this progressive, liberal European culture or whatever. It's sort of the rhetoric they're using, and they decide to try it out. So we get in 1620 the first attempt, and some pilgrims, Puritans, these Calvinists, load up on the Mayflower, and there are a bunch of other folks on there too who did not identify, by the way, with the Puritan Calvinist faith, and they set sail. 1620, they go across the Atlantic Ocean. Their destination is Virginia, Jamestown. But as seems to happen all the time in early American history and world history generally, a storm blew the Mayflower further north in the Atlantic Ocean, if you can imagine. As they're crossing the ocean, a storm blows up from the south, pushes the boat off course further north, and by the time they finally make it to land, they're all sick and tired and half-starved. By the time they make it to land, they find themselves near what is now Massachusetts, Cape Cod. And they land there, of course, at Plymouth Rock, and then go further inland and establish their little colony. Now, en route across the Atlantic Ocean, they signed what you probably all have heard about, at least briefly, and that is the Mayflower Compact, which, without getting into the fine details, basically said the majority rules. So whatever might happen, wherever they might land, because they knew they'd been blown off course, the majority of the votes aboard of the people aboard the Mayflower, the survivors, would dictate whether they stay or they go, and so on. Sort of this initial democratic document, I guess you could say, in the founding of America, in its own way. Okay, so they make it to Plymouth, they land there in Massachusetts, and they vote whether or not to stick around or get back on the ship and limp down the coast further south to Jamestown, which was their original plan. And they vote, in the majority rules, they vote to stay put. So that, basically, is how New England, Puritan New England, is established. It's basically, like so many things, by accident. Totally by accident. All right, they stick around. This is 1620. And after the Mayflower folks get there, they begin to build some little communities and deal with local Native Americans. And yes, in the first year or two, the relations between these Puritans and the local natives were pretty good. You do see some Native Americans in New England helping the British settlers out. That's where we get the pseudo-myth of the first Thanksgiving, where the Native Americans would bring, or did bring, these Puritans deer and corn and some turkeys, no doubt, and so on to share. And they both sides gave thanks for their good fortune and friendship and so on. What's often left out of that Thanksgiving story is that within a decade, these same pilgrims, these same Puritans who were giving thanks in 1621, 1622, a couple of years after they landed, were massacring the very same Indians who had helped them survive. And we'll get to that in a minute. That's conveniently, unfortunately, left out of the story often. Not to ruin your Thanksgiving or anything, but that's the true story. Okay, so the Puritans arrive, some of the Puritans, and the ones who were not technically Puritans on the ship across the ocean, the ones who signed the Mayflower Compact, most of them eventually converted and became part of the of the Puritan faith. And they established themselves. You see on your notes in your outline, I think, the name William Bradford. He was one of the first governors of Plymouth, New England, of this, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as it would become known. He actually served as governor of Plymouth Colony specifically, which a bunch of different colonies would pop up eventually. But Bradford served as the governor of Plymouth Colony specifically for something like over 35 years. It's pretty amazing tenure. But as time went by, and as more and more good, hardcore, true to the faith Puritans came across to New England to settle, suddenly we begin to see the foundations, I guess, of what we all come to think of when we think of Puritans. The faith, the Puritan faith, based on Calvinist theology, was, as you all, if you know anything about it, you understand, was very strict. It was very difficult. I mean that in the most literal sense. It was hard to be a Puritan. And the idea was, among others, and I don't mean to simplify too much here, but the Puritans generally believed that you must live as a hard-working, almost miserable life on earth in order to enjoy the fruits and the beauty or whatever of heaven. Right? There's a lot more to it, but they believed if you're having too much fun. Again, here I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but if you're having too much fun, if you have any kind of pleasure on earth, then you are likely sinning, and that is not the path to heaven and what they would consider everlasting life. And so this shaped their culture, this shaped their identity, and it, in some ways, this might be a bit of a stretch, but there's something to it. In some ways, this shaped and the identity of this Yankee, good old-fashioned hard work ethic that we still have today, this sort of stereotype. These hard-working, kind of cold, quiet, bitter Yankees, right? That all comes from the Puritan idea. It's not entirely true now. I mean, I've been to New England quite a bit, and most people are fairly friendly. They're not quite as gushingly friendly as you find in the South, which they would consider that to be fake. Southerners being openly friendly all the time and smiling and asking how you are. That's a little off-putting for a lot of these New Englanders, even to this day. They think it's a bunch of fake, and then sometimes it is, but they're still friendly folks, and but we have these stereotypes that are still there from these first Puritans and their religion. Their religious identity became their cultural identity, which became the identity of what we all think of as Yankees, right? And so this is happening over here in New England. This identity, this culture, the stereotypes, all of this of these quintessential Yankees. At the very same time, don't forget that further south in Virginia, we have the beginning of slave labor, of this cash crop agriculture society, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see right here in the early 1600s, you can begin to see the split between North and South in a very real way. And it's a split that, in some ways, at least culturally speaking, is still here today. All right, so those are the very foundations of Puritan New England. Let's talk about when it really gets amped up. And this happens starting in 1630. That's 10 years after the initial settlement. Things had grown a little bit here and there. Plymouth Colony under Bradford had grown and was fairly successful, and people had spread out then all throughout what is now Massachusetts and points north and south. And a lot of folks that I don't have exact population statistics here in front of me, but the population was growing slowly here and there. And then in 1630, John Winthrop, I have a picture of this guy. Let me show it to you. John Winthrop, a hardcore Puritan, believing adamantly in this Calvinist theology, which I'll define in a second, came over in 1630 with about 1,000 people, all of whom were these hardcore church members. And it's this infusion of 1,000 straight-up Puritans, Calvinist Puritans in around 1630, that would once and for all make Massachusetts Bay and all the colonies therein this hardcore Puritan New England that we come to think of. So Winthrop comes over, and in 1630 brings over all these people. He joins with the Puritans and others who were already there in Massachusetts in this colony, and Winthrop sort of takes over. And he proclaims that there's going to be a new, larger identity embodied by colonial New England. And this is, we as good Puritans living here, isolated from the world, will serve as a beacon of light up toward which the rest of the world can look in order to see how they should live. In other words, we are going to be, and this is a direct quote, a city on the hill, or I've also heard it, a city upon the hill, toward which the rest of the world looks up to see what real God-fearing life should be. Right? We're going to be an example for the world to follow. He believed, Winthrop and his followers, the rest of the Puritans, believed this is the best way to convert the masses, which most Christian religions, Protestant or otherwise, are all about converting and getting people to join their faith. And Winthrop believed this is the best way. Let's show the world how we do things, and they will flock to us, basically. Was his idea. Okay, now this is a good time then, with Winthrop and this infusion of 1,000 more Puritans in New England, it's a good time to take a step back and try to understand exactly what is this example? What is this shining light, this city upon the hill that Winthrop so strongly believed the rest of the world ought to emulate and join? What is, in other words, Puritan Calvinist theology? Well, Puritanism is based on this Calvinist belief, in part, of, you guys might be familiar with this, of predestination, which is part of the Puritan dilemma, as it's famously called. So that's part of it. John Calvin, during the whole Protestant Reformation, you have Martin Luther and John Calvin, and so on. He came into play protesting the Catholic Church in the 1500s and started his own sort of Calvinist religion in France and throughout that part of Western Europe, which held, among other things, again I'm simplifying here, but held among other things that people upon birth were predestined for heaven or for hell. And it varies over time and place and what people believe, but many early adherents to Calvinism believe there's nothing you could possibly do. Being predestined, there was nothing you could possibly do in life to get out of going to hell or versus heaven. Yet, the Puritan theology held, as practiced in New England, that you still must, you'll never know if you're predestined, by the way. Right? But even though then, you should live a puritanical, in the term that they would use, life, in which you spend your life participating in good works, that is, good deeds, doing good, being good in life, helping people, doing the right thing, this sort of thing. It's open to interpretation, of course, what that means, doing the right thing. That's part of it. And the other part is, as you'll see in the lecture notes, and you'll read about this, being accepted with grace, the covenant of grace, right? And having this connection directly with God. Right? So you have a covenant, this sort of agreement in the Puritan religion, a covenant of good works and a covenant of grace. And through this grace covenant, as established by John Calvin and as practiced and believed by the Puritans in New England, there was, again, what they called a chosen elect, who were predestined for heaven. Right? The rest should, no matter what, work hard, do the right thing, live a hardcore life of work and good deeds, and I guess hope for the best. Again, I'm simplifying this a little bit, but essentially, just based on that alone, you can see why many scholars, religious scholars and otherwise, have called this the sort of the Puritan dilemma. It's a very difficult faith and belief system to keep people going on. I mean, it's a bit depressing, certainly from our standards looking back, especially this whole predestined thing, but even for their standards at the time. And when they, as we'll see, when they saw that there were other opportunities, other options, the Quakers and Anglicanism and some of these other religions, many of the subsequent generations of Puritans, the children and grandchildren of the Winthrops and the people he brought over, they would fall away from the Puritan faith, or they would try to reform it in different ways. Anyway, so that's sort of this theology, this Puritan covenant theology based on Calvinism, and I'm just scratching the surface here, but that's sort of the Puritan dilemma in the way they believed. And so their day-to-day life, especially by the 1630s on, was, again, hard work. They very much, by the way, believed in early forms of what we would consider capitalism. There's a reason why New England became the center for trade and commerce on the Atlantic, at least on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the shipping and the merchant marine industry was enormous by the late 1600s into the 1700s, and a great deal of income, of wealth, was generated by Puritans and the sailors and the merchant marine based out of Massachusetts and other ports farther north. The whaling industry was big, trade, because they were a part of the British Empire, which I need to make that clear really quick. Puritan New England was a colony of the British Empire. Right? It wasn't completely separate or independent, although they pretty much got to do what they wanted, so long as they paid their dues and were peaceful. Same as in Jamestown and further south. Right? So they worked hard. There were a lot of merchants, a lot of money, but they lived modestly. They worshipped modestly. They didn't have the big churches, the stained glass, the hierarchy within the church. That's the stuff they tried to reform. They tried to cut that out of the Anglican Church. Instead, they would meet in these very basic structures with a few windows to let some air in, and often Puritan congregations would sit in these hard wooden pews with straight backs. I've seen some visiting up there, some actual pews from these churches, and they would sit there sometimes for 4, 5, 6 hours straight, take a break for a little while, come back 4, 5, 6 more hours, listening to somebody like Winthrop, or as we'll see later, Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, some of these fiery Puritan preachers shouting at them, mostly in negative terms, about how they sinned and so on. Right. By the 1640s, there were approximately 13,000 or so Puritans or people, let's put it that way, people in New England, citizens in New England, and that would continue to grow. So they were on par almost with the Jamestown settlers further south by the 1640s. All right, really quick, let's talk a little bit about how they dealt with Native Americans. Last time when we talked about Jamestown and Virginia and that colony, I gave you some stories about, just some typical stories of Native American warfare and how they dealt with it. It's pretty much the same in New England, suffice it to say. The example I like to use here is known as the Pequot War of the 1630s. Let's see here. In the early 1630s, the Pequot Indians nearby, mostly down a little bit south of Massachusetts in what's now Connecticut, kind of had an uprising to protect their way of life. And the reason they had this uprising was due to Puritan New Englanders pushing them off of their land. Same old story. It's a broken record. That's happening down in Virginia. That's going to happen throughout all of America. And there were some land disputes and some other issues, and New England Puritans had become allies with some of the traditional enemies of the Pequot people. And so one thing led to the next, and before you know it, there's a war in the 1630s. Right. The reason I'm bringing this up is not because it was an enormous conflict or cost very much for the Puritans. They didn't lose many, but it's a good example to give you a sense of the style of warfare and the mentality of these Puritan New Englanders, of these Puritans, basically. Right? So in the 1630s, when this war broke out over land disputes and so on, over the Pequots' audacity at trying to protect their way of life and their own land, there was a declaration of war, as you see here. You can read through that, and then it was on. There was some small fighting, a few little massacres both ways. I mean, the Indians would kill whites, the whites would kill Indians. The white allies came in, and the Native American allies to the white Puritans came in and would butcher the Pequots. This kind of stuff happened on a regular basis. And then, eventually, the Puritans saw an opening. In 1637, as you can see there, in what becomes known as the Battle of Mystic Fort, also known as the Pequot Massacre, white Puritans, these are those pilgrims, those nice little porcelain pilgrims you can pick up at the store and put up at Thanksgiving with their pitchforks and their cool-looking hats. Right? Those same pilgrims, Puritans, the militia basically, got their guns, their pitchforks, mostly guns, swords and so on, and decided to march down to Mystic Fort, to this, what was the Pequot Village area in Connecticut. It's right along the Mystic River, if you're familiar with that, Mystic Pizza and all that, the modern-day movies. Same area. They marched down to Mystic Fort and to the Pequot Village because the Puritans knew, thanks to their Indian allies, that the Pequot warriors had left. They went off onto the warpath to come around and try to attack the Puritans. While they were gone, the Native American civilians, the Pequot civilians, women, children, elderly, were still there, largely unprotected. So the Puritans got their guns and marched south along with lots of Indian allies and came upon the Pequot village, surprised them, and wiped them out, according to contemporary accounts written in a bragging fashion almost by the Pilgrims themselves, the Puritans themselves. They said after some small fighting, they set the village on fire. There was a perimeter, kind of a wooden barrier perimeter. They set the village and the wall on fire, and as the women and children and elderly tried to escape, they were shot down, butchered, basically. And there are accounts of Puritans parading little kids, Indian kids, around on their swords and so on. There's just this horrible bloodlust among these people. And the very next week, they'll go to their pew, go to their church, and listen to what they would consider the gospel as good Puritans. They believed, like the English settlers down in Jamestown, they believed that these Native Americans were subhuman, basically. They were heathens. At best, they were agents of the devil or something, right? And so it didn't make any difference to them. They could easily justify butchering them. They were enemies and agents of the devil, potentially. They were subhuman and so on. So they could, most of them, could square with the idea of being a good Puritan, worshiping and doing good works and good deeds and so on, and maintaining this covenant of grace with God, while at the same time killing women and children, innocent, who can't even fight back. Hard for us to understand. Hard for some people at that time to understand for sure, but that's reality. Those are the Pilgrims for the most part. And this is just one little example. This is the 1630s. This kind of stuff is going to continue to go on from the 1630s on. until there are no more Native Americans left. So, there you go. That's the city on the hill that I guess that Winthrop wanted everybody to look up to. All right. What next? I'll show you a little map here for a while. By the 1640s, 50s, 60s, in the 2 or 3 decades following the Pequot Massacre, the Battle of Mystic Fort, whatever you want to call it, and as more and more Puritans came over and other colonists came over to New England, the Puritan church leadership, the structure of the church began to undergo a series of problems. Mostly, they were losing people. There were more people coming to New England, but they were actually losing, percentage-wise at least, members of the church. People were leaving the church. There was dissension in the ranks, and this was troublesome. A lot of this had to do with the faith itself, this whole Puritan dilemma. It was tough to be a Puritan, for the most part. Day in, day out life was hard. If you were having fun or whatever, you're probably sinning. I mean, that's a tough thing to hang on to. You have to be very devout, very committed. Right? So that alone was tough. But also, gradually by the 1640s and 50s, as the population continued to grow, church leadership began to make it increasingly difficult to become basically a card-carrying member of the church. I don't think they actually had cards, but you know what I mean, to be an actual full-fledged member. You had to go through this entire open public conversion experience, and sometimes it took months or years of tests, literal tests, as well as everybody's watching you and judging you kind of tests, to see if you're worthy of becoming a full member of the church. Now, if you're not a full member of the church, you still had to go to church. You were expected to, and you're still a Puritan, basically, but you don't have any kind of church membership. Certainly, you're not going to be eligible for church leadership. This applied to men and women. And so this conversion experience and this experience of becoming a member, sort of this church was tough. It was, it humbled the best of them, and many people didn't make it. They couldn't cut it for a variety of reasons. And the problem was, by the 1650s especially, was politics, right? With the lowercase p. A lot of the church leadership throughout much of New England they had certain people they liked and certain people they don't. I mean, it's just like you see in society everywhere today. And if you were on the wrong list, if your father or grandfather or uncle or you yourself had done something to anger one of the members of the church, one of the people judging whether or not you should become a full-fledged member, then you were out of luck, no matter how much you proved yourself to the congregation and to the church leadership. So all these things, the fact that it was just plain difficult to be a good Puritan, life was hard. Life was hard everywhere in this time period compared to what we have today, obviously. But it was even harder to be a good Puritan. And even when you were a good Puritan, you were still not exactly certain of where you were destined. Plus now, on top of all that, if you had political enemies or if you didn't do or say just the right thing, you could not become a full-fledged member of the church. And on and on. And people were falling away. The youth of the day, the crazy youth, these kids were deciding not to follow in their fathers' and grandfathers' footsteps and instead run off and join the hippie Quakers next door in Pennsylvania. I'm only slightly exaggerating there. Right? The Quakers were kind of the hippies of this period, in a good way, I think. And so, all these things combined, mixed with some very high-profile cases of people breaking away. You'll read about these guys, Roger Williams, Ann Hutchinson, and some others splitting from the church, led to the overall dissension and eventually the crumbling of the old 17th century Puritan church. They're grasping here. They're trying to figure out a good way, the Puritans are, to bring people back in. In 1662, they established what was known as the halfway covenant, which meant that you were halfway a member of the church once you were baptized at birth. And then, in other words, it was a way for them, the church leadership, to say, well, you're halfway there already if you're baptized at birth, and you don't have to work quite so hard to become a full member. But they're relaxing their rules, and they're getting rid of some of their politics a little bit too late. This was 1662. It helps a little bit. 30 years later, everything's going to fall to pieces in 1692. That's what I want to talk about next. That's a good way to close out this discussion of Puritan New England. And that is, of course, the witchcraft craze in Salem. Right? Here's some other maps to give you a sense of the growth here, not just in New England, but in America as a whole. Kind of soak these up. Here's a great map of the influx of settlers, of colonists into New England in this time period. And it just continues to pick up, so much so that by the 1690s, there were a huge population, many of whom were breaking away and falling away, as the preachers would say, from the church, being tempted by the devil and his agents, the witches and warlocks and whatever, demons in society. And so things kind of come to a head then in 1692. I was lucky over the summer, just last month, in fact, to have traveled up to New England and visited, finally, for the first time, Salem, Massachusetts, and what is now called Danvers, Massachusetts. It's just a little community right outside of Salem. And Danvers used to be called Salem Village. And I think I'd heard this before, but I'd forgotten. But it's a misnomer to think about the Salem witchcraft trials as having been centered in actual Salem, what is now Salem, Massachusetts. Yes, some of the trials actually happened there, but very few of the witches, so-called, the accused witches, were actually from Salem. You can see here, this little map, this is pretty good. It breaks it up. Down here is the Salem of today. That's where it is. That's where it was then. There was Salem, then up here there was Salem Village. And it was actually in Salem Village, what is now Danvers, Massachusetts, where all the really crazy stuff went down and where the supposed witches lived. You guys know maybe the basic story, but let me recap how it all kind of started. It was in the spring, summer of 1692 that just sort of out of nowhere, it would seem, there's more to it than this, but it would seem out of nowhere, in this guy's house, Reverend Samuel Parris's house, in fact, in the kitchen area, suddenly he heard his daughter and one of her friends, I think it was a cousin, screaming. Pots and pans hitting the ground and just a lot of commotion and so on. He was in another room. They were in the kitchen area chatting, he thought, with their servant, a lady named Tituba. Her name, I think, is down at the bottom of this. Tituba. She was an African slave, but she also was part Native American and had some lineage that could be traced down to the Caribbean, and did practice, by most accounts, some forms of religion from that area that resembled, at least in the Puritan eyes, something very close to what they would consider to be witchcraft. All right, so here's a lot of commotion. His daughter is screaming. Her friend, I think it was her cousin, was screaming. They were flopping around on the ground. Pots and pans were going everywhere. Tituba was nearby. He runs into the kitchen. You can almost envision this. You've seen a lot of this if you've seen The Crucible. He runs in to see what the commotion is all about. And there, his daughter and her friends are saying that Tituba had cursed them, had bewitched them, and and the rest is the Salem witch trials. Basically, what happens then? Parris raises the alarm. Tituba is arrested. She's put on. She's interviewed basically, and there she kind of goes back and forth. By most accounts, I don't think she was quite all there at this stage, unfortunately, which led to the hysteria. She was kind of waffling back and forth on the stand, being examined, cross-examined. She supposedly admitted to being a witch, and it went back and forth. And then she started listing names of people who were immediately arrested as her accomplices. And now the entire village, all of what is now Danvers, but at the time known as Salem Village, was on the lookout the witches, the devil, basically, and his agents, the witches, were at work in their very midst. Right? That's how it all begins. That's sort of the spark that lights the powder keg that blows up into the Salem witchcraft hysteria. Right? And a lot of innocent people, in fact, unless you believe in witches and witchcraft, I'll leave it to you, but all of these were innocent people. From my point of view, from the historical record, were arrested, rounded up, and something like 19, I think, were hanged until dead, as they say. And one unfortunate man was accused of witchcraft and was pressed to death, meaning they laid him down on a hard surface. They put as I understand it, then they put a board on top of his body, and they began to put heavy stones on top of that board until he was basically crushed. He could no longer breathe. The others were executed by hanging. So who were these people? How did this happen? Beyond Tituba and this scene in Reverend Parris's house. Well, most of the folks, they're mostly women, some men, most of the women who were accused of being witches were outliers in society. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily, but they were women who often dared to live by themselves without a man protecting them and taking care of them, which society had seen, especially in Puritan society, very conservative, very, very religious society. They did not, plain and simple, they did not think that women could or should live on their own. And so any woman successfully living on her own and surviving by herself without the help of men must have some kind of help from somewhere else. And that could only come from God or the devil. And these women living by themselves in the outskirts of Salem Village were not getting help from God, most people believe, so it must be the devil. Right? That's a simplistic line of reasoning, but that's basically what was driving a lot of these folks. Mix that, these people who were always kind of uneasy about these women who were living by themselves or who otherwise were strange or outcast in society, mix that with the plain hysteria that just swept through Salem Village and Salem proper and all of Massachusetts in this time period. And it doesn't take much for accusations to start flying, and as soon as somebody was accused by another legitimate citizen of the colony, they were almost always arrested, put on trial, much like Tituba. And it didn't help that during these trials, including Tituba's, that the people confessing against them would often put on these shows in the courtrooms, these crazy, ridiculous shows, at least from our standards today. In fact, I think it was when Tituba was up giving her confessions, the two girls who had been convulsing there on the kitchen floor were there to testify against her. And somewhere during the trial, they began to flop around on the floor of the courtroom, believe it or not. I mean, literally just flopping around like they're having a seizure or something, slobbering from the mouth, yelping and yelling and so on. Just strange. And this is in front of town, all the important people of the village and the judges and all this. And they were saying, of course, that it was Tituba bewitching them right there and then. That was enough. Tituba was done, basically. That she was convicted, even though she'd kind of admitted to being a witch anyway, which whatever that means, right? Again, unless you're somebody who believes in witches and witchcraft, that is, she's clearly not all there. And so other people were rounded up. Again, many of them were these women who were kind of seen as outcasts in society, unfairly put on trial, examined. I have some pictures to show you, a picture to show you in a minute of sort of them being examined by the judge. And I mean examined in the most literal sense. They were stripped almost completely naked, these women, in Puritan society. And there were some other women present as the judges were looking around. What they were doing, they were looking for the mark of the devil. This could be anything. It could be a strange-looking freckle or a mole or a scar. If they thought you were a witch, they would find something. Who doesn't have a freckle somewhere, right? And they would do this. I'll show you an image in a minute. And that plus somebody testifying against them was often enough to convict them of being a witch and sentence them to death by hanging or other means, 19 of whom eventually did go to the gallows. Even, I was reading about this over the summer, even a couple dogs who were thought to have been accomplices of some of these accused witches were executed. Even the poor dogs were being killed for being witches. This is 1692, which seems like a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, it isn't that long ago. And this is what was happening. It was craziness. This sounds like something that ought to be happening back in the dark ages of Europe, back in the 900s or something. And it was. I mean, there were witches and so-called witches and stuff then too, but not in the late 1600s, not right on the cusp of the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and all of these things. And you have this. It's embarrassing and it's sad for these people. Not all of the ladies who were arrested and convicted and executed for being witches were these outliers in society. In fact, while I was in New England over the summer in July, I visited the house of Rebecca Nurse, who you might, if you're familiar with the trials, you'll know her name. I think she was about 72 years old in the summer of 1692, when she was accused of having been a witch because some of her neighbors did not like her or her husband. She was married with kids and grandkids. They did not like her or her husband, and it's still disputed a bit to this day, but there was a land dispute. They wanted part of her land and whatever. The bottom line is, because of this neighbor dispute, this elderly lady who was absolutely innocent and who denied to her deathbed, to being hanged anyway, denied being a witch, and who had a large chunk of the community voluntarily came out and vouched for her. They signed their name saying that this lady, Rebecca Nurse, is a good, God-fearing Puritan woman. She is not a witch. Nonetheless, because she was accused and because they found a freckle or whatever on her, she was sentenced to death and hanged. I think it happened in July 1692. The reason I mention her is because, first, she was a regular, well-connected, she fell into what people believed women should be. She fell into that category, which is, in and of itself, it's silly, and we'll talk about that later. But she was a mother and a grandmother, and she was married. She wasn't living by herself. She didn't give any signs at all of being creepy or a loner or anything like that. Yet, because of this land dispute, one of her neighbors, angry, accused her of being a witch. Again, arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to hanging. And she was. She was hanged until dead in July of 1692. Anyway, the other reason I mention her, use her as an example to talk about this, is because this is her house, of course. And this is her actual house. It was amazing. I just took this picture a month ago. It's beautiful. You can walk around. This is in Danvers, not in Salem. There's very little witch stuff in actual Salem, even though everybody goes there. There's a creepy cemetery. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And some really cool old buildings. But that's where a few trials happened. But the actual homes of people accused of being witches are in Danvers. And there's far less traffic and fewer tourists in Danvers. I recommend going there first. And that's where this is too. It's a neat place. You can walk around the house. The original house, the same exact house with the same floor, same walls, same ceiling, really cool, that Rebecca Nurse herself lived in, is this section here, the section closest to me. So you go from the chimney all the way toward me, and it's that section. The rest of it on the far side was built on later. All right, so you go from the chimney toward me, and that was the original house. And you can go inside there, like I said, and look into this. Maybe it's just me, but this is pretty cool. You can look into the same fireplace, at the same rocks and the same bricks that were there just like that when Rebecca Nurse herself was looking into that fireplace, wondering about her fate. It's a sad thing. And right down the hill from this house, Go on further down, I don't know, 100 or 200 yards, and there is a family cemetery, and it's somewhere in that cemetery that Rebecca Nurse is buried. We don't know exactly where that is because witches who were executed were not allowed proper Christian burial. Usually their bodies were buried in a shallow grave, unmarked. So most of the people who were killed, executed, we have no idea where they are. Her family, some of her grandsons snuck in after dark, disinterred her body from the shallow grave by the gallows, and brought her back to the family cemetery there and buried her. It's a really sad story, and it gets right at the heart of this ridiculous hysteria that is blowing up, and where neighbor feuds and other things lead to innocent people dying, basically. Anyway, next time you're up in New England, definitely go check this place out. It's really cool. The Rebecca Nurse Homestead. Right. Here's that image I was telling you about earlier. Rebecca Nurse, Martha Carrier, all kinds. Tituba, all these women who were accused of being witches were subject to strip searches, and these crazy trials. And here's a famous painting of this, which it's crazy. The irony here is ridiculous because this is Puritan society where women and men were expected to be, puritanical in every way. And here they were with these old geezer men strip searching women. Right? It's crazy. I have another quick story. That's the one of Martha Carrier. I usually tell this one too. Before I went to visit and saw the Rebecca Nurse house, this is the one I would tell. And again, really quick, Martha Carrier. She also, I think, was married, had some kids, but she was accused of being a witch during this hysteria that summer, 1692, because she had a run-in with one of her neighbors. They'd had an ongoing dispute about his cattle encroaching and eating on her land and eating her crops. Right? And they exchanged a few words, as neighbors do when they have a little feud going on. Who knows what exactly was said, but the bottom line is that her neighbor, the man who was walking a few cows by her house to move them to a different pasture, he testified to the judges and everybody else that shortly after their interaction, his cows grew sick and died. So she must be a witch, bewitched his cattle. Right? And so based on that accusation, Martha Carrier was rounded up and sentenced to hanging. And you see there, this is it was done a little bit later, but she was put in the back of a wagon, and with the noose wrapped around her neck, hanging on a tree limb there, and they would whip the horse. The wagon would go out from under her feet, and there she would hang. Right? And on and on. Again, about 19 were hanged. One was pressed to death. A few dogs were killed, which is horrible. Humans dying is horrible too, but there's something about dogs being executed for being witches or agents of witches that's just ridiculous. And eventually things began to simmer down. So by the fall and winter of 1692 into 1693, right around Halloween, what we now consider Halloween, of 1692 into early parts of 1693, suddenly high-powered officials in Salem, but especially in Boston nearby, began to grow a little bit weary of this whole crisis, especially when some of their loved ones were being accused. I'll show you some pictures here. This is the old burying ground in Salem, the actual town of Salem today. No witches are buried here, or so-called witches, because they were not afforded proper burial, but a lot of the people who were living at that time, including some of the judges and ministers and so on, caught up into the hysteria, are indeed buried here. These tombstones go way back to the early 1600s, actually, not just the Salem witchcraft trial period. It's a really neat, creepy cemetery. Check it out when you're in Salem next. Now, really quick, before we get to the very end of this crisis, how it all comes to a close, I told you that by October, November of 1692 into early 1693, many of the church leaders and the colonial leaders began to get a little iffy about this whole deal. But some, including most famously Cotton Mather, try to take advantage of the witchcraft craze. I'm just going to give you a little snippet of one of his sermons that was later published to give you a sense of how he's trying to take advantage of this craze to basically scare Puritans back into the fold. Right? He says, this is a direct quote from Cotton Mather. You can almost imagine this guy standing up at the pulpit there and screaming out with his veins popping out, spitting and yelling, his face turning red, all of this stuff, trying to scare people back into Puritanism. He said, quote, this is during the whole craze, "And we have now with horror seen the discovery of such a witchcraft. An army of devils is horribly broke in upon the place, which is the center and the firstborn of our English settlements. And the houses of the good people there are filled with the doleful shrieks of their children and servants, tormented by invisible hands, with tortures altogether preternatural." Right? And on and on and on and on. You get a sense for how he's thinking. Now, who knows? I'm sure he truly believed that witches existed, that the devil was there. But it's also true that people like Cotton Mather and other leaders of the church thought that this might be a good opportunity to exploit this craze, to show Puritans this is what happens when you're running off and becoming Quakers, when you're leaving the Puritan church, basically. This is the kind of stuff that's going to happen. The devil is going to come in, and here we are. Now we're suffering because people are falling away from the church. So maybe this ought to serve as a way to scare you back in. But it doesn't. It doesn't, because as I foreshadowed a minute ago, by late 1692, early 1693, a lot of high-level officials began to suffer directly from this craze, including the governor of the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Phips. His name has been spelled in multiple ways. You'll see it both ways. William Phipps's own wife suddenly was accused of having been a witch. And at this point, using his authority, including the militia in New England, Phips called a stop to it. He ordered the trials to cease. He very quickly, in early 1693, ordered the release of all of the people arrested for having supposedly been witches, which is like 200-something. And he and other Massachusetts Bay officials tried to do everything in their power to sweep this whole unfortunate, embarrassing, horrible incident under the rug and forget about it. Right? And so by 1693, suddenly, everybody in New England and in America tried to pretend that nothing ever happened. And it's horrible. It's horrible for the people being arrested, of course, or who were arrested, but it's especially bad for those 20 or so who were executed, who were totally innocent. Obviously, it's bad. And that's where it comes to a close. What does all this mean? It's a great story, obviously. Lots of movies and books and so on have been done and will continue to be done about this. Thousands of tourists flock to Salem, not Danvers. They need to learn their history. They flock to the wrong town every October to go and try to scare themselves walking around. And those cemeteries are spooky. That's a consequence, I suppose. But historically speaking, this does a couple things. First, it's sort of the final nail in the coffin of the old conservative Puritan church. When people have a year or two to kind of reflect on what had just happened, it's like going to a big crazy party and regretting it the day or two after. That's what this was. That people experienced immense regret following Salem after the witchcraft craze. And this hurt the Puritan cause more than it helped it. It did not scare people back into the fold. It helped them to justify leaving entirely. It also is a reflection of how women were seen and treated in society. It gives you a good sense of everyday life in this period, especially with regard to gender roles and this business. Right? It's an unfortunate thing that's not really going to get much better until the early 1900s in terms of how women are treated and seen in society. And even then, we still have a ways to go. So there's a lot of other consequences, some of which we'll build on as we move forward. But there you go. There's a snapshot of the foundations of colonial New England. And in Unit 3, we'll kind of spread it out and talk about everyday life, a little bit about slavery, although that's mostly further down the road, and some other issues. Thanks, and have a good one.